We are now going to take a look at the different categories of interest groups that exist in the country. Depending on the researcher that you talk to and the textbook that you read, this list may vary a little bit in what they call each category. But what I want you to be familiar with is these 5 categories. These categories are, in a lot of times, very closely related to the 3 reasons that people join interest groups that we talked about in the previous video. Okay? And you will find that some of these categories deal with strictly financial reasons for existing. Some exist strictly for intrinsic purposes. And a lot of them exist both for financial and social reasons. So let's take a look at these 5 categories. And the first one being business interest groups. This is pretty straightforward. National Corn Growers Association, National Association of Manufacturers, National Association of Textile Manufacturers, things of organizations of that nature. What these business organizations exist for is primarily to look out for the financial well-being of the owners of these businesses. If you're a business owner, you want to make sure that your business is profitable and that other businesses similar to yours are doing well. Another example of a category of interest groups would be labor unions. Labor unions like the AFL-CIO, National Pipefitters Association, the Teamsters, all of these different unions exist for financial reasons, like business interest groups. But the major difference is that these labor unions exist to look out for the well-being, financial well-being of the employees. So they do very similar things. The National Pipefitters Association wants to make sure that laws that are passed by Congress or by state legislatures benefit pipe fitters. Well, the National Association of Plumbers maybe is a business interest group because there are people who own plumbing businesses. They produce plumbing equipment, they produce pipes and things like that. They're both dealing with the issue of plumbing, but the business interest group is going to tend to look out for the interest of the business owner, whereas the labor union is going to look out for the interest of the individual employee. Now, another example of an interest group category would be professional associations or professional organizations. If I'm a lawyer in the state of Missouri, I have a profession. And I want to make sure that other individuals that are in my profession are qualified, quality lawyers. And I don't want there to be too many lawyers in the state of Missouri, because if there are too many lawyers in the state of Missouri, then my demand goes down and my ability to earn money goes down. So a lot of times professional organizations will look out for the well-being of their members by doing 2 things. Setting standards for that profession, like the Missouri Bar Association sets the standards for what you need to do to become a lawyer in Missouri. So they set the standards. And the second thing that these professional organizations might do is they regulate the industry. They tell lawyers or dental hygienists or dentists or whatever what they can do and what they cannot do. They're regulating the industry to make sure that safe, effective methods are being used by all members of the profession, because if one lawyer does something wrong, a lot of times that will reflect on all of the lawyers. Okay? Now, another category of interest group is a little bit different one, and we call it intergovernmental groups or government interest groups. And this one is a little bit harder to understand, especially if we remember our definition of interest groups. Interest groups are groups of people who have common values, beliefs, and opinions that try to affect a specific area of public policy without getting their members elected to office, or without getting their members elected to government positions. And you need to understand that these intergovernmental interest groups, like the National Governors Association or the National Association of State Legislators or the National Association of City Clerks, the National Association of State Attorneys General, all of these government interest groups are made up of individuals who joined that interest group after they got their government position. I would not be a private citizen who would belong to the National Association of Governors and then try to get elected governor. The way it would work is, when I got elected to be governor, then I would join the National Association of Governors. Because just like plumbers have things in common and lawyers have things in common, which encourages them to join, create interest groups, government officials, like governors, have things in common. Most governors deal with the same issues. All governors have to interact with the president and Congress. So all 50 governors in the state, in the country, come together, create the National Association of Governors, or the National Government Association, and they go to the president and they go to Congress every year saying, hey, we think you should do this in relation to dealing with the states. Or we really think when it comes to Medicaid policy or Medicare policy, when you're dealing with the states, we think Congress and President should do certain things. So these intergovernmental groups are created, and they are created to try and influence public policy. But the members of these intergovernmental groups are simply members of that group because they've already been elected or appointed to a certain governmental position. And then the final category of interest groups is what we call public interest groups. Again, some interest groups are looking out for the financial well-being of business owners, some are looking out for the financial well-being of a particular profession, some are looking out for the well-being of a certain group of employees. Whereas public interest groups are looking out for the well-being of the public in general. In other words, if I belong to the National Association of Clean Water, what I'm doing is I'm joining a group trying to ensure that we have clean water. And who benefits from clean water? All people benefit from clean water. If I belong to the National Audubon Society, which deals with bird watching and natural habitat for the different birds around the world, who benefits from us protecting the habitat of birds? Everybody benefits. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union. Who benefits if we ensure that everybody's civil liberties are protected in the country? It should be the public in general that is benefiting. So again, when we look at the three reasons why people join interest groups, the material reasons, the social reasons, and the intrinsic reasons, we can see those three reasons for joining interest groups fitting nicely into these 5 different categories of interest groups. Now that we have an understanding of why interest groups are created, we need to take a look back at the definition of an interest group and realize that an interest group is a group of individuals who have a common interest that want to influence a specific area of public policy. So in other words, if I'm a member of the National Association of Soybean Growers, I want to influence public policy in the area of soybean policy. If I'm a member of the National Association of Model Airplane Enthusiasts, I want to influence public policy or the rules and laws that are made that regulate model airplane flying. That we need to understand that interest groups are not in the business of getting their members elected to government. So interest groups are not in the business of becoming government officials so they can make the laws themselves. We talked about that earlier. There is a huge misconception about interest groups when it comes to how they influence government officials when they're making public policy. A lot of people believe that interest groups simply open their checkbook and they write checks and they make financial donations to political parties, to political candidates, and to political organizations. As we'll find out here in a few minutes, interest groups really are prevented by law from giving money directly to candidates or to candidates' organizations. If I was going to give you 3 ways that interest groups try to affect public policy, they would be 3 very straightforward, basic ways that they influence public policy. Interest groups influence public policy basically by providing information, and providing information. This seems to be kind of redundant, but I'm trying to make a point here that interest groups' most powerful asset is that interest groups know a lot about the topics that their interest group was created to protect. And if I've got a lot of information about the best way to grow soybeans, I want that information to be turned over to the individuals who are going to make soybean policy. When members of Congress are making laws, they're not always experts on the laws that they're writing about. A lot of times they have to bring people in to help them understand the very, very technical aspects of writing some legislation. So many times it's going to be these interest groups who provide the information. Interest groups provide information to 3 basic groups of people in the country to try and influence public policy. Obviously, they'll give government money, they'll give information to the government entities that make the policy. These interest groups also want to give information to the general public, because if the general public knows a lot about soybean policy or what good soybean policy is, the general public can then contact the government officials, and not only are the interest groups trying to influence these public officials, but they're also getting the general population to contact these government officials. And then the third group of people that interest groups try to present information to is their own members. Because some of these interest groups are very large entities. And if there's 50 million members of an interest group, it's hard to keep all 50 million of those members going in the same direction, especially if they're not reading the same information, if not being provided with the same information. So interest groups will provide the latest research and the latest information about their topics to their members. And their members then can, individually or as a group, try to influence public opinion about things, or those interest group members can try to directly impact the decisions that government officials make. So interest groups are in the business of providing information. Do they provide other things? Do they provide some assistance in trying to get certain people elected? Absolutely. Do they provide some money to some issues? In some ways they do, yes. But the primary way that interest groups influence public policy is by providing information. And I'm going to break that process of providing information down into 6 primary activities. There are 6 primary activities that interest groups engage in when trying to influence public policy. And you will notice that at the center of every one of these 6 activities is providing information in some form to some group of people with an attempt to influence public policy. The first activity that interest groups engage in is what we call lobbying. And if you look at the list of activities, we actually list 2 different types of lobbying: government lobbying and grassroots lobbying. Government lobbying is very very specific form of activity. Government lobbying is when representatives that work for the interest group go directly and talk to public policymakers. They talk to the bureaucrats that make rules. They talk to members of Congress that are making the law. Government lobbying is also known as direct lobbying. It's when somebody who works for the interest group goes and provides information and research and other types of things directly to the government policymakers, whether bureaucrats or elected officials. Another example of this direct lobbying is when these people who work for these interest groups go before Congress and they testify. Maybe Congress is looking at writing a new law about regulating the extermination business. And who do they want to bring in to provide information about this new law? Is the people who are impacted by this new law. Those exterminators and those other interest groups. Now, government or direct lobbying can be done in two ways. Either you could hire a professional lobbyist, a person who basically you contract with. He's not necessarily an employee of the interest group, but he has access to government officials. And what you do is you pay this professional lobbyist a certain amount of money to take your information to these government officials. It's very expensive to do, and it's primarily the larger interest groups that do those types of activities. And then the second type of direct lobbying is when you send leaders from within your interest group. I worked for a group called Missouri Primary Care Association, and our primary job was to look out for the well-being of community health centers in the state of Missouri. We couldn't afford to hire a professional lobbyist, so what we did was our executive director managed the company, but he also went and talked to members of Congress and members of the state legislature on behalf of community health centers. Government lobbying can be very effective, but it's very expensive. The second type of lobbying that I talked about is grassroots lobbying. And grassroots lobbying is generally less expensive, but more difficult to do. What grassroots lobbying is when an interest group will get its members, or people who care about their issue, to contact government officials on behalf of the interest group. For example, when I worked for the Missouri Primary Care Association, we had millions of people in the state of Missouri who got low-cost health care through community health centers. So what we attempted to do is we attempted to get those people who use community health centers to contact government officials. They necessarily weren't members of our interest group, but they were people who cared about our issue. Now, grassroots lobbying is difficult to do because it's a lot of people doing it. If you hire a professional lobbyist, it's just one person. You tell him exactly what to do, and he goes and does it. But if we have 1 million people in the state of Missouri that are using our community health centers, and we want them to contact government officials on our behalf, we've got to make sure that they're contacting government officials and providing the government officials with the information that we think is important. So we have to provide this information to 1 million people. This can be very effective if done properly, but it's also very difficult to do. If you've ever heard the old saying, it's like trying to herd cats. You got a herd full of cats, you got 100 cats, they all want to go in their own direction. The same thing. If we've got 1 million people that have utilized community health center services, they might each have a different reason why they think community health centers are good, but we want them talking about specific issues that we have identified as most important. And it's very difficult to get that information in your hand and get it out. It's less expensive, okay? And it used to be very difficult to do. But it's a little bit easier now that we have websites and emails and text messages and things like that. It's a little bit easier to do. Okay? The next type of activity that interest groups get involved in is interest groups will get involved in elections. If I'm a member of the National Rifle Association, I care about who's getting elected. I don't want one of my members necessarily to, I don't want my executive director to get elected to office, because if my executive director gets elected to public office, he has to start worrying about issues in addition to National Rifle Association issues. So I don't want my executive director to become an elected official. But as a member of the NRA, I do want people to get elected to office who agree with the National Rifle Association's positions. So individual members of the National Rifle Association are going to go out and work on behalf of candidates. Individual members of the National Rifle Association are going to give political campaign contributions to individual candidates. But you have to understand that interest groups as a whole, the National Rifle Association, the National Association of Corn Growers, the Missouri Association of Soybean Producers, those interest groups as a whole can't take some of their money and give it to political candidates. The Supreme Court has said that's unconstitutional. And the reason for that is, if I have an interest group like the AARP that has 35 million members, not every single one of those members are going to support the same political candidates. And in order to be a member of the AARP, I have to pay dues. And the Supreme Court says it's not fair if some of my dues that I have to pay are going to be given to a candidate that I don't support. So interest groups are not allowed to give direct contributions to political candidates. But since interest groups are made up of people that have the same common beliefs about an issue, what will happen is those people who are members of an interest group will usually create a separate organization called a political action committee. And the political action committee, which is technically a separate entity from the interest group, will still be made up of people who belong to a particular interest group. But when they join the political action committee, they're joining the political action committee knowing that that political action committee is going to give the money that they give to the political action committee to certain candidates. Political action committees have one purpose, and that is to influence political campaigns. Interest groups exist for several reasons. Influence political campaigns is only one of them. So understand that when you listen to the TV and to the radio and you hear people talking about interest groups having too much influence over our political process because they give contributions to candidates, it's not the interest groups, it's those privately created political action teams. They're very closely related to each other, but they are technically separate entities. The next way that interest groups try to influence public policy is by influencing the public. If I want Joanne Emerson to know that it's important to support gun control legislation, sometimes it's more effective to convince the public in Joanne Emerson's district that gun control is necessary. Because if you convince the public that gun control is necessary, they're going to start talking about it, they're going to start encouraging people to pass gun control, and Joanne Emerson is going to hear her public, and Joanne Emerson is generally going to respond to her public. Interest groups also sometimes just want to influence the public to buy their members' product. Some of my favorite commercials are things like the incredible edible egg, pork, the other white meat. Those are campaigns or television campaigns that were created to encourage Americans to purchase more milk, to purchase more chicken, to purchase, more pork. we're looking out for the economic well-being of the national pork growers. And what's one good way to do it? To convince the American people that pork is healthy. How do you benefit the egg producers in the country? You convince the American population that they should be buying and eating more eggs. And then if your public is buying a product and is really excited about a product, then public policy is going to fall in line. Again, we're providing information to the public so the public can try and influence the public policy. Another example of how interest groups try to impact public policy is by boycotting, or what we call direct action. If you are an environmentalist and you don't want them to cut down a bunch of trees in a certain part of town, you can do the direct lobbying, the grassroots lobbying. You can try and persuade the public. You can try and influence elections by creating a public political action committee. But if none of those things work, what do? You go chain yourself to the tree, or you go picket in front of the trees where they're going to cut the trees down. The idea of protests or direct action is to show public policymakers that people care about it. The Million Man March in Washington, D.C. Why did those million men come together? To show the public policymakers that the issues that these men care about are important, and that they're willing to spend the time and the money to come together in this large group in Washington, D.C. And if they're willing to come together in this large group, then they're probably willing to go out and vote and influence who gets elected. Direct action through protests and boycotts and these massive marches aren't things that we see quite as often as we used to. Because the only way in the past to show the members of Congress that a lot of people cared about an issue was to bring 1 million people together in the National Mall. But now what we can do, instead of having to spend all the money to bring 1 million people to Washington, we can create a website and ask mothers in the country to log on and sign a petition. Now, instead of having to spend millions and millions of dollars to get 1 million moms to Washington, you spend a couple of $1,000 to create a website, and 10 million moms can sign this petition, and the petition is then sent to the members of Congress, and they know that a lot of people care about the issue. But still, what these direct actions of protesting are doing is it's providing information to these elected officials. And then the final example of way that interest groups try to impact public policy is through litigation. And litigation is simply going through the court system. Again, if I'm that person who wants to prevent those trees from being cut down, and I go through all of those first 4 or 5 examples of ways to influence public policy, I even chain myself to the trees, and the government still says we're going to cut those trees down, what's the next answer? You sue the government. You take the case to court. And if you get the court to hear your case, then the court says, government, you can't chop those trees down until we've decided this case. And sometimes those cases will drag out in court for years and years and years. And in the meantime, you prevented those trees from being cut down through litigation. Sometimes, though, interest groups aren't big enough to be able to afford a lot of lawyers and spending a lot of time in court themselves. So what these interest groups will do is, instead of suing the government or suing some agency to try and change public policy, they'll take a look at the information that their little interest group might have, and they might say, hey, can my information that I have, can it help the courts make a decision that would benefit my issue? For example, if there's an interest group that's trying to prevent a bunch of trees from being cut down, the example we already used, and there's a huge interest group like the Sierra Club or something is suing them in court. If I've got some information that's going to help the court decide that those trees shouldn't be cut down, I don't have to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to send a lawyer to court to testify, I can create what's called amicus curiae briefs, or a friend of the court brief. I take the information that I have, the research that I have, and I write it up in legal format, explaining to the court that here's some information. I think this information is pertinent to the case that you're dealing with, and here it is. It doesn't cost me any more than the time to type it up, the paper to print it on, and the postage to mail it off. I'm taking information that my interest group has, introducing it into court, and I'm trying to influence the decision that the court makes. And so many times, the decisions that courts make greatly impact the direction of public policy. So those 6 activities are specific examples of activities interest groups engage in, and at the bottom of every single one of them is the desire of these interest groups to get information out into the hands of either the policymakers, the general public, or their individual interest groups.